Chapter 45. The Easy Way is Mined. Around 10:30 in the morning, First Sergeant King moved into the central stadium, followed by Splitter and Suppressa. This was, at one time, definitely the right place. Now, however, it was abandoned. Only blood, trash, and corpses remained. Governor Mame's head stood next to Dr. Malice's on stakes near the center of the field. On the monitors, Ashley was still organizing their defense. Several hours old, the broadcast was a perfect distraction. Sergeant King watched as Ashley spoke to some of the kids on the monitors overhead. In the background, the prisoners huddled on the field. In reality, however, the killing was over, and had been for some time. The orphans had played them all. King directed Splitter and Suppressa to the rooftop access door. They flew over the stands and exited the stadium. Outside on the rooftop, Corporal Suppressa pulled off his mask and vomited for the second time that morning. First Sergeant King radioed Captain Snow. "Ma'am, we have a problem." Hovering over a crowd of teens and adults at God's Hotel, Snow replied, "Only one?" "The stream was delayed by a couple hours at least. It's a mess in there." Suppressa threw up again, loud, wet, and meaty. "We're going to need a minute before we're airborne," King said. "Copy, First Sergeant." Splitter interrupted. "Ma'am, permission to speak." "Go," Captain Snow answered. "We need to redistribute the charges," Splitter exclaimed. "Say again?" "We should sink this shithole. They have to pay for what they did. Those were citizens." Splitter sounded angry and irrational. "Sergeant, we're talking about children here. They're savages, animals, all of them. This place is a cancer. Senator Miller is right. We should burn it off the face of the earth, that girl especially." The staff sergeant advanced on King. "We can't let them do this." "They did it. Can't be undone," King said. "We can't let them get away with it. We can't just let them sail out to high water. This is bullshit. I swear to God, I'm not letting them get away with this." Splitter gestured with his rifle. More than once, he'd pointed it directly at First Sergeant King. King looked at Splitter and made a decision. "You're right. Okay, you're right. Here's what we're going to do." King walked over to the woozy Suppressa. He shook him by the shoulder. "Can you fly?" Suppressa nodded. "Get your mask on." King triggered his comm set. "Captain, we're moving. Splitter's right. This is something we have to take care of now." "Say again, Sergeant," Captain Snow ordered. "We're coming to you, Captain. I think we should meet in the security wing. Get ourselves squared away." The soldiers heard her exasperated sigh. "Copy, Sergeant." Suppressa turned and stepped off the rooftop. King and Splitter followed, with King taking the lead. They sailed toward the rooftop of God's Hotel. On screen, Ashley directed hundreds of orphans in preparing for the imminent police attack. In a nod to Drews and a deft consolidation of power, Ash had commissioned the gang leaders as her generals. There were tons of things that needed doing, and tons of kids who needed things to do. Whatever she didn't handle personally, Big Chris or Drews took over for her. Kasimov and Hambone, with Jones, Rudy, and Taylor, were occupied with the car keys. They handed out keys and radios to four-man fire teams. Using the radios, the teams were able to find the correct cars for the corresponding keys with an astounding lack of difficulty. Before long, groups of armed orphans had been assigned to the necessary posts relative to their specific cars. The police, deceived by the false broadcast, believed the children were still in the stadium. It seemed likely that they intended to kill the hostages. Mayor Westbury's hackers disabled the crisis box and he gave the command to launch the full assault. With hours to prepare, the orphans had carefully hung the terrarium netting across the open spaces in the district's parking garages. From behind it, they watched the police gear up for their big approach. The Zeros kept their weapons below the ledge, waiting for the perfect moment. The police and National Guard vehicles sailed through the crisis box as the orphans' rifle barrels slipped up under the netting. From behind the thin layer of bulletproof material, from open windows inside the school, from everywhere on the bolt, the orphans opened fire. They had the officers and soldiers from every direction and fired in concert. The police vehicles, though heavily reinforced, took a significant beating. The barrage scrubbed the cruisers clean of every unarmored protrusion. Mirrors, lights, antenna, landing gear, all were destroyed as the vehicles made their play for a successful boarding. However, the blaze of gunfire didn't stop the assault. It was the stream of citizens being pushed from the lower-level garages that caught law enforcement's attention. The adults were being pushed out into empty space, 120 seconds between them and the ground. Several of them were missing arms, or holding them, severed limbs falling with them. The combination of the incoming rounds and the forced ejection of the hostages caused the assault to break apart. Several vehicles immediately began rescue operations circling downward, collecting the falling bodies with their nets. Some of them hit the vehicles, leaving bloody marks in their passing, but none were missed. Inside the garage, Dante smiled. After about 100 adults, he cut off the stream of forced jumpers. His plan worked. Their assault had crumbled. The news crews focused on the chaos and broadcast images of the falling bodies. In his office, Mayor Westbury leapt to his feet. An irrepressible grin slathered across his face. Leonard feared the implications of that grin, but he was too late. They were both damned. The portion of the incoming assault team that managed to land found themselves on the old orphanage. The Zeros had deliberately left it unguarded. It was the one place they could easily contain the officers. Using a leapfrog strategy, the kids tactfully retreated. They let the police take ground, only to find it booby-trapped, and then attacked again. After losing a couple officers, the cops became irrationally desperate to hold their ground. The children would let them have it, and then withdraw a little more. Soon the orphans had withdrawn to the bridges, and then those were blown. The old orphanage became the police department's default HQ in the district. Several teams had been assigned to secure the stadiums. It was a central part of their strategy, and it was from that area that they had been fought the hardest. Before the assault, it was presumed that most of the orphans were occupied with the violent posturing inside the stadium. Now it was clear that the broadcast had been a ruse. The volume of fire that met their initial assault, along with the expulsion of the hostages, implied that the images on screen couldn't be happening in real time. The orphans had been lying in wait. The police forces had been reduced to half strength in a single assault. Several vehicles had been too damaged to make an accurate landing, and others were tied up rescuing falling hostages. The commanders knew their cause was lost. They could never take and hold the district against such superior and organized numbers. Several soldiers acknowledged that the textbook definition of the word infantry had beaten their years of experience and superior firepower. The orphans had shown power, decisiveness, and cunning. The ruthless expulsion of the hostages had forced the police to reconsider their approach. A few SWAT teams came in from directly overhead. They reached the rooftop of the domed amphitheater and made their way down to the next smaller group of stadiums. Prepared for imminent hostilities, they discovered the abandoned central stadium where the corpses littered the field. By radio, they confirmed what many already suspected. The broadcast had been delayed. The trio of combat engineers approached the top floor of the facility commonly known as God's Hotel. They wirelessly hacked a maintenance door and entered. Invisible and silent, King, Splitter, and Sorpresa floated at the end of a hallway in the infants' ward. Sounds of new lungs crying and cooing gradually registered as signs of life, as opposed to the cries of death they so resembled. God's Hotel had been one of the West Coast's premier resort hotels. Then it had grown old, fallen out of fashion, and been donated to charity. The district allocated the unit for toddlers and infants. Life on God's Hotel was the inverse of the rest of the district. The younger the child, the higher the floor they lived on, starting with the maternity ward, which they currently floated through. As the orphans grew older, they moved down through the building until they started school. At that age, they were transferred to the old orphanage or the athletic complex. Once a child entered school, getting sent to the bowl was relatively easy. All you had to do was mildly annoy any of the adult supervisors on the wrong day. God's Hotel was paradise by comparison. The next two floors were that of the hospital fused with a preschool. The combat engineers remained silent as they passed the nurses, huddled with the babies and toddlers. The video monitors had been disconnected, the shades were drawn, and the women kept the young children focused on games or stories, distracted from what was happening outside. King thanked God they were invisible. He was well aware that their presence would have caused the room to devolve into panic and desperation. Evacuated personnel occupied the lower levels, teachers, nurses, and soldiers who'd voted to surrender citizenship in the interests of survival and equality, but mostly survival. King entered the administration wing. They met Captain Snow in the security offices. King led the soldiers to an empty holding cell, seeming to desire private conversation. Captain Snow shut the door. They pulled their oxygen masks off. "Okay, look, I get it," Splitter said. "No one wants to sink a bunch of innocent kids. But they're not innocent. What they did in the stadium was unforgivable. There must be 100 corpses in there. Citizen corpses. Someone has to answer for that." First Sergeant King looked at the floor. "There's a lot of play here. We have to be cautious. We don't call the shots." The staff sergeant looked over to his captain. "So what are we going to do?" "We aren't going to do anything," Snow answered. "Then what are we doing in this shithole district?" he asked. "They're killing U.S. citizens. We can't allow that. This is all because of that guy Kilo. Fuck that son of a bitch. Where is he, anyhow?" "He's double-checking the detonators, making sure everything is still wired," Captain Snow answered. "He's doing his job." Splitter didn't like the menacing looks he was getting from the first sergeant and Captain Snow. Like he'd been hit with a laser, he realized what was happening. The others watched understanding wash over his face. Splitter pulled his weapon. No one spoke or moved to stop him. He held it, pointed at First Sergeant King. "Do you realize you're pointing a weapon at me, Sergeant?" Splitter lowered the gun. King put a hand on his shoulder. "You seem a little stressed out. I need you to take a step back for a minute. We're not going to put anything in your jacket, but things are about to get really hairy out there, and we still have a mission to complete. Do you understand what I'm saying?" Splitter nodded. He calmly gave up his weapons without a fight. "Go on. Take a seat, kid." Splitter sat down on the wall bench of the plastic holding cell. Snow, King, and Sorpresa replaced their masks and stepped out. Splitter stayed on the bench. Captain Snow locked the door. Outside the cell, Captain Snow told King to take Sorpresa over to the athletic complex and look for kids or adults who needed medical attention. King nodded, and they set off. Chapter 46. You Can't Go Home Again. On the first-level athletic complex parking garage, Ash sat in the passenger seat of a convertible muscle car. The Metamicronics dug into her hip. The canvas top was up. Kaz sat in the driver's seat while Sky and Jeff were huddled in the back, cramped and buried in rifles, cases of ammunition, and gear. Ash listened to 2 radios. They had one tuned to the police band and another handheld unit for reports from the teen commanders. The cops were in a tailspin. The police had returned fire, but only briefly. Dante's bold gambit had paid off. Ash had deliberately left the hostages in the stadium so they would be protected during the firefight. But once the police assault became a rescue operation, chasing falling adults, it hadn't taken much effort to figure out what had happened. Ash clearly remembered Dante volunteering to guard the hostages. It had seemed odd, and now she knew why. "We need to keep them alive," she had said. "I understand." Dante had looked her in the eyes. She had confirmed the forced exodus by radio, but decided not to confront him over it. His idea, however ruthless, had worked. After all, he had released the hostages, alive. It would be difficult to argue with his success, and now was not the time. Instead, she kept the orphans focused on their efforts to protect the parking garages and the others still hiding in the dorms. They listened to the radioed reports. Once they got news of the police breaching the stadium, Ashley climbed out of the stuffy car. Kaz joined her, followed by Sky and Jeff. The sounds of gunfire came to them from everywhere and nowhere. All around them, kids ran back and forth with supplies for their teammates. Kaz triggered the ragtop, retracting it into its compartment. Since she had played such a central role in the on-screen diversion, Ashley's fire team wasn't involved with the initial assault. If the police had spotted her outside the stadium, before they realized the broadcast was a scam, that jig would have been up. Besides, Ashley didn't want Jeffrey running around in the mix. It was easier to watch him if he was with her. She had insisted that he stay with Sky, in the car, keeping them both out of harm's way. Now that the police had discovered their ruse, there seemed little reason to remain in the cramped vehicle. Passing orphans waved to them, but no great catastrophe met with her getting out and stretching her legs. All across the district, the Angel City officers were ruthlessly pinned down by the coordinated teens. The orphans had acquired all the district's small arms, and they didn't hesitate to fire on the cops. In spite of the chaos, the police and National Guard had secured a landing site on the backside of the old orphanage. They streamed ships in until there wasn't any more room to anchor. In the end, they had more than 200 officers with boots on the ground, but their command was fragmented, severely hampering their effectiveness. For the most part, the orphans showed little or no restraint. They killed indiscriminately and without mercy, as if their lives depended on it. Soon the officers were reduced to isolated pockets of soldiers holding defensive positions. Without clear objectives, they were easily outmaneuvered and picked off. The police department's crisis control center, a massive flotilla, was anchored outside the district, beyond the range of the children's weapons. In a control room, a junior officer approached his superior. "Mayor Westbury again, sir," he said, handing the phone to Major Schoenville. Westbury demanded the major commit all his soldiers in a surprise attack. "Well, it wouldn't really be a surprise, sir. More of a second wave." The mayor's reply was not heard. "Yes, sir. Right away, sir." Schoenville hung up. The control room was silent. The men waited, looking at the officer. He raised his head. "Direct order. Open fire. All weapons." The men passed the command down the line. A ripple went through the ranks, and the assembled soldiers opened fire on the district. They opened up with everything they had, mostly small arms fire. They hadn't come prepared for a siege war. They didn't stock rockets or missiles for regular patrols. As soon as the gunfire started, Dante again began forcing citizens out into the empty sky. The National Guard and Coast Guard had foreseen this tactic and deployed large numbers of nets and rescue craft. Still, the wicked maneuver did influence some officers to hold their fire, if only so as not to strike the falling citizens. Across the city, Mayor Westbury watched the firefight with a pair of binoculars from his balcony. He laughed, giggled, and danced about like a rather large, ungainly child. Leonard sat alongside, silently enjoying the sunshine, thinking he might have to buy Detective Cole more than one beer to apologize. For 11 minutes, the cops and guards rained wave after wave of hot fire at the orphanage. They only paused to launch troops and transports and reload. The orphans themselves fired from behind cover, when and where they could. 3 times they turned the assault craft back. Some were killed on both sides, but no new ground changed hands. From her place deep in the garage, Ashley was hearing troubling reports. Despite the fact that no one had been firing from God's Hotel, orphans and police alike reported that it had taken a significant amount of damage. Ashley hadn't posted any shooters there, deliberately to keep it from becoming a target. The police also knew the resort facility was designated as the toddler's residence and had refrained from firing at it. Ashley and her crew ran over to the northwest side of the garage. They were up above the hotel and had a perfect view of the chaos. It was burning in 3 places, and the front area was massively destroyed. Dozens of windows had been shot out, and the fires fed columns of thick black smoke high into the air. The bodies of murdered citizens and small children were strewn across the grounds. Sometime earlier, Keller and Morgenstern reached their destination. They crossed the athletic complex and boarded the maintenance section of God's Hotel. To reach the main floor, where most of the children and adults had congregated, their best route was through the maintenance corridors, into the administration section, and through the abandoned security offices. As they passed the holding cells, Morgenstern, with his enhanced vision, saw that a soldier had been imprisoned. He saw that Splitter wore the powered-up phase camouflage, making him undetectable to the naked eye. Morgenstern explained their good fortune to Keller. The senior-ranked colonel entered the cell and ordered Staff Sergeant Splitter to remove the phase cam control unit. Splitter was, at this time, invisible, and it was clear that Keller couldn't see him, yet there was no way past him and through the door. He remained silent. Keller drew his weapon and turned, handing it to someone in the hall. Morgenstern stepped into the small cell, raised the weapon, and fired at Splitter's head. It only took a couple minutes to strip the camouflage unit and attach it to their rolling weapon system. Keller cranked it up to full volume, giving them a 12-foot radius of invisibility, and made their way toward the building's front atrium. There were almost 1,000 adults gathered with the resident toddlers on the hotel grounds. Children and adults milled along the shore of the miniature lake that dominated a large part of the grounds. They hung out in the gardens and the sitting rooms, filling the spaces throughout the ground floor of the building. Keller and Morgenstern moved out to the front, an unseen, lethal presence in the midst of those who had voted for life and equality. With a ripping sound not unlike an invisible bolt of lightning, Keller and Morgenstern opened fire. Red-hot slugs ripped through the crowd, destroying everything in their path, plant, animal, or otherwise. Within moments, they decimated the lobby and the ground floor. Captain Snow had been caught off guard by the brutal attack, and only got off 3 rounds before they moved inside. She dropped, chasing them, but the moment she found a clean shot, they seemed to withdraw further, destroying everything they came across. The machine gun reduced all matter to hand-sized chunks, furniture, people, and walls, pulverized into single servings. The children and citizens had no idea who was firing on them, or which way to run. As Captain Snow pursued the murderers, they entered an elevator, ascending to spread death among the least deserving children and nurses. Snow could hear them firing again on the upper floors. She flew out to the front of the building and fired at them through the walls and windows. The copper rounds from her .50 caliber plasma rifle ripped through the glass and wood, but veered and ricocheted off the beryllium armor plates of the death machine. People screamed and ran in every direction. Even though she was able to track Keller and Morgenstern across multiple spectrums, she had nothing resembling a clear shot. She was obscured at every turn, while their targets surrounded them. Snow was overcome by the massacre left in their wake. Flames licked the walls and the grounds of the resort. Bodies of children and adults alike were carelessly strewn, broken, red and black among the smoldering grounds. Frustrated, she relayed the situation to Gray, King, and Sorpresa, who didn't even know the hotel had been attacked. After locking up Splitter, they'd been airlifting wounded kids to ambulances parked around the district. Before long, they were escorting ambulances into the district, hiding them from view, and getting them back out invisibly. Gray had just finished double-checking the charges on the far side of the district when Snow called for support. Keller and Morgenstern escaped the inferno of God's Hotel through a freight entrance on the far side. Captain Snow had begun mobilizing some of the surviving nurses. The killers were halfway across the bridge to the athletic complex when the battery in Splinter's phase cam reached the end of its charge. Having cranked the device to its highest imaging radius, they'd burned the unit out. Now half of the district, and a number of cops, watched as they wheeled their guns across the open trestle. As most of the gunfights had paused to admire their handiwork, no one missed them. The volume of firepower that rang out from the garages chased the 2 veterans behind the heavy shields of their cart. They pushed forward, desperate to reach the corridors of the complex and escape the line of fire. From her place in the garage, directly above them, Ashley set the last 3 grenades to contact detonation, pulled the pins, and dropped them over the ledge. The grenades hit the bridge right in front of Keller and Morgenstern and triggered the explosive set by Gray earlier, utterly destroying the wheeled machine gun mount. The smoke cleared to reveal Morgenstern, lying unconscious 50 feet back, near the entrance of the bridge. Keller was nowhere to be seen. On the radio, some of the orphans reported having seen him fall. It wasn't clear how he'd avoided the Coast Guard's rescue nets, but he wasn't spotted in any of them. As Gray flew toward God's Hotel, he too saw the Colonel and Mortician attempting to cross the bridge with their wheeled guns. He watched Ashley drop her grenades. Huddled behind the SWAT shields, the explosion knocked Morgenstern unconscious, and Keller was tossed over the edge. Gray dove for the falling Colonel. He didn't want a bunch of rescue workers catching the homicidal sociopath. That wouldn't end well for anyone, except maybe Keller. The Colonel's leap hadn't carried him very far when Ashley's grenade set off the charges under the bridge. Even Gray felt the concussion, and much closer, it knocked Keller unconscious. Gray caught the falling Colonel and carried his dead weight high into the atmosphere, his phase camouflage rendering both men invisible. Inside his sealed armor, Gray was capable of climbing to 25,000 feet. Keller was only wearing loose SWAT armor. He had no protection from the harsh climate of higher elevations, and no oxygen to supplement the necessities of consciousness. Gray pulled an elevation disc from his pack and strapped it to the unconscious officer. He set the disc to 30,000 feet, its highest setting, and let Keller go, up into the wild blue yonder. Gray let his own kit softly carry him back down to the action below. Eventually, the police and orphans stopped firing at each other. The orphans had to be low on ammo, and it was getting close to noon. 11:43. 17 minutes until the detonations would begin. Gray scanned the action with his helmet cams, as well as his newly enhanced vision. The orphans held their posts, containing the police on the old orphanage. Many were close to their vehicles. Anyone who hadn't found a vehicle was hiding out in the dorms, armed to the teeth. Gray pondered the mission's objectives and realized he was witnessing a compromise on the part of the powers that be. The military-industrial complex had been satisfied with the hibernation of the Beta Wing. The crimes committed by the mayor's cousin and her crew would be covered up in the destruction of the old orphanage. The social activists would be spared the spectacle of an entire orphan population being executed for rebellion, despite the fact that dropping them out of the supply chain was equally terminal. Gray landed on the old orphanage and headed for the central gravity drives. The charges had been set on the main elevation controls, the terrarium discs, as well as the bridges and braces. This unit was going to come apart from the district, and then explode into 100,000 little pieces as it fell from the sky, unless he stopped it. Gray knew that Mayor Westbury was involved with what had happened here. Westbury had been a prison governor, once upon a time. His cousin, Agatha Dorchester Mame, had been one of his assistants. The least Gray could do was preserve the crime scene for the lab boys. He reached the drive bays unseen and pulled his detonation control from its pouch. He called up all the devices and, one at a time, disarmed them. He left only the charge on the central power coupling activated. When it detonated, the commands from the control panel would be interrupted. It could be easily repaired, if necessary. The unit would fall with the others, but it wouldn't be destroyed. It would drift to a stop first, while the other buildings would glide out over international waters, where the orphans would be out of the jurisdiction of the law enforcement personnel who currently surrounded them. This unit would crash on the shore of the Pacific Ocean. The ACPD would be forced to investigate it. Even though the national capitalists and their bioengineering wing would remain a secret for a while longer, Governor Mame's crimes would be front-page news before the week was out. Mayor Westbury stood at his open patio, watching the district through a telescope. He watched the clock, 11:47. He watched 20 news stations on a sectioned monitor that had been moved out onto the expansive patio. Leonard didn't know what to think. He didn't know how to judge himself for his role thus far. What precedent could provide a measure for his personal culpability in this fiasco? To what layer of hell was he to be assigned? The only thing Westbury needed was a violin. What neither of them expected was a man's hand to reach up over the patio railing. A second hand joined the first, and then a head came into view. The intruder, plainly dressed as a reverend, with a black suit, collar, and cross, was huffing and puffing. He was clearly winded. Leonard rose and gestured to one of the patio chairs. Westbury frowned. "Offer the burglar some water, why don't you?" The man's identity suddenly came to both of them. They had never met Reverend Wolf, but his file was on the desk. Obviously, this was the man Director Trafford was searching for. The FBI director and his team currently occupied a group of suites below the mayor's office, searching for the Reverend over the District 13 security cameras. Wolf leaned against the railing, exhausted by his climb. Obviously reading their faces, the Reverend held out a reassuring hand. "I'm just here to talk. I don't want any trouble." Waltman lifted the handgun at his side. He didn't remember reaching for it, but it was there, just the same. The Reverend, however, was faster still. He raised a large pistol at Waltman and fired. The secretary felt his gun-wielding hand suddenly go numb. The weapon leapt from his hand, but he saw no blood. Had this man just shot the gun from his hand? The Reverend raised his left hand, gesturing for patience. "Just one question, and I'll go right back the way I came in. Who was it? Not on D13, I mean. In the government. Just tell me who it was, and I'll leave calm and peaceful." Despite his honey-coated tone, Wolf slowly inched forward, the pistol leveled at the mayor and his secretary. Westbury caught his breath. "Director Trafford, with the FBI, is right downstairs. I'm certain he'd like to speak with you. Shall I call him?" "Who sent him?" Wolf asked. "I imagine you did, indirectly," Westbury answered. "Let's focus on directly, then. Someone called you and cleared him, and now you're going to tell me who that someone was." A wasp had flown in and was agitating the air between them. Allergic, Mayor Westbury was terrified of them. He waved and swatted at it. The insect flew away. "Who?" Wolf demanded. "Go fuck yourself, I'm not telling you anything," Westbury shouted. Wolf laughed. A moment later the large mayor screamed and flailed at his own chest. He slapped and pinched at the wasp, having already been stung. Flinging the insect away, Westbury collapsed into his chair. The black stinger protruded from an angry red welt above the mayor's open collar. Waltman moved to the large man, but Wolf raised the pistol. "He's allergic," the secretary shouted. "Then he'd better tell me what I want to know." Westbury's breath was already growing short. The wound was swelling with each passing heartbeat. "Miller! Senator Miller's who you want," the obese mayor rasped. Reverend Wolf moved toward the railing, but not lowering the gun. Waltman turned to grab the phone, but before he even spoke the word, "help," Wolf was gone, over the side, true to his word. A few minutes later, the mayor was breathing, albeit unconscious. Director Trafford and the on-staff medical team had stabilized him. Trafford showed Waltman the insect's stinger. It looked natural enough. The director then placed it under a portable microscope his team had on hand. Waltman was astonished to find the device was not organic at all, but clearly mechanical. This guy Wolf, whether he's the inventor or simply a representative of larger players, wherever he gets his technology, it's top-shelf stuff. Even the military isn't this precise. Waltman laughed. "What's so funny?" Trafford asked. "He's a reverend, get it? He works for God." "God has no jurisdiction here." Trafford wasn't joking. Waltman couldn't help himself and burst into laughter. For all he knew, the reverend might actually work for Senator Miller, and Westbury was being punished for having spoken the man's name. But he doubted it. "So then it's not allergic shock at all?" Waltman asked. "Nope, neurotoxin cocktail. There's no telling when it'll come out of it, or if. To my knowledge, the previous victims still haven't, but they haven't died yet either, so..." Waltman nodded. He plainly disliked the redundant director. In the distance, the charges set on District 13 began to detonate. The assembled medical techs and law enforcement personnel turned to watch the fireworks. This was what he always wanted. What kind of karmic justice is at play that he's missing it? Waltman thought to himself. Waltman watched with the others, the once mighty ex-mayor Westbury, comatose and already forgotten, unconscious behind them. Chapter 47. High noon. 10 minutes earlier. On the athletic complex, Ash and Kaz searched for Morgenstern, while Jeff and Sky protested from the back seat. "Drop down to the campground level," Ash told Kaz. "There's someone we should pick up before this place goes to hell." Kaz laughed at the irony of this statement. He slipped past a couple roadblock vehicles, guarding a parking structure entrance, and waved to the orphans as the convertible sailed out over empty space. He dropped the car into a gentle spin, dusting off on the lowest level just seconds later. From far outside the crisis box, the cops didn't fire at him. He was harmless, and their single car certainly couldn't escape this blockade. Rather than pulling up to the garage, Kaz put the convertible down on an open picnic area of the forested level. The four of them climbed out. The lower levels were half the size of those above. It was just big enough to get lost, but not for more than 20 minutes. From inside a maintenance corridor, Morgenstern saw the sports car pull out of a garage and drop down to the lowest level of the complex. With his newly enhanced vision, he'd been able to make out Ashley in the passenger seat. He'd seen her drop the grenades onto the bridge as well. He'd been seeing too much of her for far too long now. The black-eyed mortician reached the campground a few minutes later. The elevator doors opened, and he exited into the lush forest. Morgenstern carried a bright red fire safety axe, holding it low at his side. Together, Ashley and Jeffrey climbed a nearby hill. "What are we doing out here?" Jeff asked. "I told you, someone we have to find," his sister answered. As they crested the hill, Jeff saw Morgenstern in the distance. Ashley saw him too, and he saw them. "That guy?" Jeff asked. Ash quickly pulled him back the way they'd come. "No, not him," Ash answered as they raced back down the hillside. As they got back to the car, Ashley's watch beeped. It was 11:57. She keyed her radio. "All zeros, go Bravo! Go Bravo!" Without waiting for any kind of response, she switched the radio off and dropped it in the back seat. "What's going on?" Sky asked, with Kaz standing nearby. Ashley just raised her finger to her lips, gesturing for quiet. "Get the guns and get ready," she whispered. All across the district, the children heard the command and repeated it out loud. "Go Bravo!" They stopped whatever they were doing, switched off the radios, and abandoned their positions. Some orphans sprinted for the dorms, The teams with cars ran for the garage. The cops, most of whom knew something about traps, weren't hasty to pursue. Many kids were wounded. In the classrooms, in the bolt, and in the garages. Anywhere they had fired from, several lay bleeding, and many would die before nightfall. Those surviving did their best to make the wounded comfortable. It would be some time before any medical attention could be provided. On the campground level, Ash dug through her pack. The grenades were gone. The pack held a few ammo clips, but it was mostly filled with badges, dozens of them. Kaz handed out a variety of guns from inside the car. Morgenstern then appeared on the path, a heavy axe at his side. Ashley found herself staring at the black orbs that had replaced his eyes. She raised her rifle, but Kaz beat her to it, firing from behind her. Morgenstern broke for the nearby forest. Ash looked over to Jeff and Sky and gestured to the car. "Get in and lock the doors." Jeff and Sky looked blankly at the convertible. The top was down and the locked doors wouldn't help anyone. Then Ash was gone, sprinting after Morgenstern and quickly out of sight in the overgrown forest. Kaz had already taken off on the hoverboard. On it, however, he was moving far too fast and had already lost the stealthy Morgenstern. Ashley caught up with the murderer in a small area where the trail opened up into a little clearing. Here they would be able to attack each other freely, not constrained by the underbrush. Ashley stared at him. He held the axe out to the side, suggesting that her use of firearms didn't constitute a fair fight. Ash shrugged the assault rifle into the grass and drew her sword. Hovering above, the invisible Captain Snow watched them begin the ancient ritual. On the athletic complex, the garages were a flurry of activity as kids waited for the explosions to start. Some fiddled with car radios, torn between their own news story and the never-ending search for good music. They argued over what to listen to, an entertaining activity in and of itself. In the old orphanage, its amalgamation of police officers, SWAT, state and National Guard troops tried to come up with an operation they could agree on. Captain Gray switched off his phase cam and marched into their command center, where he confronted the commanders, informing them of the demolitions set throughout the building, and explained that the central gravity drive had been wired with pounds of munitions. He didn't recommend tampering with it, but suggested they vacate the building immediately. The officers all recognized the black bar below his name tag, which read Kilo. They didn't ask any questions. Gray walked from the hall, turned a corner, and vanished. Several officers ran off to the gravity drives. They found the explosives and radioed back to their off-site commanders, who asked if they were joking. Ash held her sword directly before her and advanced slowly. Morgenstern remained perfectly still. They were nearly within striking range of one another. The giant's axe began to move in lazy circles at his side. Suddenly it arced toward her face, but missed. He changed direction and came at her from the side. She evaded. He jabbed and hooked. She stepped back out of range. Morgenstern was overextended, trapped in a weak and especially vulnerable position. The teen girl smiled. She'd played this game before. This game she knew well. Ashley struck, moving in with the sword and slashing several times. The Tyrrhenium alloy blade easily separated the threads of Morgenstern's jacket. The jacket itself, however, was also Tyrrhenium weave, and though Ashley had ruined his suit, what should have been fatal strikes barely drew blood. She had to realign herself for a thrusting strike. Morgenstern evaded the thrust and smiled. Ashley caught him with a slash, taking the top part of the first knuckle of his left hand and slicing the side of his face open. She caught him straight down the cheekbone and took the top half of his right ear. The powerful giant had moved, barely. If Ashley had been just a little faster, she might have clipped his carotid artery. As he jumped back, he dipped a little, putting her aim off. Morgenstern chopped an axeful of dirt into her eyes, almost obscuring the bits of finger and ear lying on the path. It was noon. The charges on the main bridges detonated, followed by the main struts. Then the supporting braces exploded. The district buildings, no longer locked in place with each other, began to drift apart. Some bridges and supports hadn't fully separated. The metal screamed and cried as it bent and ripped apart. District 13, which had come into being almost 200 years ago, despite its many iterations, had for the first time come asunder. The plaintive cries of its metal struts and braces were heard throughout all of Angel City. From a distance, news crews watched the buildings push at the deactivated crisis box. For a moment it arrested their movement, And then, stressed beyond its capacity, the magnetic cable lock snapped and unraveled. The cables fell away from the district like streamers from a cruise ship. Previously held down by the other structures, the athletic complex and administration building both gained altitude, rising into the sky. The admin building, like a punch ball held underwater, climbed over the athletic complex and the bolt. The old orphanage, God's Hotel, and the school buildings all dropped away from the athletic complex. The bolt seemed to sink below the athletic complex, but actually stayed level. From inside their cars, anchored to the magnetic locks in the garage levels, the orphans watched the horizon tilt and shift as the units lost equilibrium. They watched the remaining police officers and National Guard troops evacuate, their vehicles streaming away from the tilting and tumbling structures. Above them, the administration building suffered another series of explosions. It caught fire and quickly dropped from the sky, falling directly into the old orphanage. The extra weight began to sink both units. SWAT teams had rescued the surviving children from the upper floors of the old orphanage, but if the building were destroyed by the burning administration facility, all evidence of what happened there would be lost. Gray had disarmed the charges that would have destroyed the Victorian-style structure. Yet without the power coupling, it would still fall and crash. He approached, not looking forward to tackling the gravity controls himself, but it would be necessary. He knew how to bypass the destroyed coupling, but first he had to clear the admin building, which was driving the old orphanage downward. The admin building had come down against the orphanage, perching itself atop the second structure. From the direction of their descent, Gray simply couldn't tip the orphanage over. He needed to spin them 180 degrees first. Gray shot for an open door on the ground level. Once he reached the control room, rerouting power and actually tilting the building was another matter entirely. There were 4 drives set across the main floor of the building. Gray powered up number 3, and the southwest corner shifted toward the sky. He adjusted his personal gravity controls to stay in front of the main panel, powered up number 2, raising the southeast corner of the facility. The building shifted again and began to spin. Then, with a shrill metallic scream, the massive structures slid away from each other. Both buildings dropped from the sky, but now heading out to sea on their own trajectories. Captain Gray powered down the 2 drives and got off as quick as he could. The slowly fading charge of the drives and the cushion generated by the buildings below would prevent the structure from crashing into them like a cannonball. Instead, it would glide out over the metropolis, away from the city lights, until finally setting into the shorebreak of the Pacific Ocean. Chapter 48. Gates of Heaven. On the athletic complex, down on the forested level, the sword-wielding ballerina and muscle-bound murderer paused out of respect for the explosions happening around them. They watched the charges set on the bridges and connecting struts of the district explode, pushing the units away from each other. The ground under Ashley and Morgenstern shifted. Shaped like a 5-tier box kite, the athletic complex was massive. It served as the anchor for all the other units of District 13. The complex held its structure. Gray and the other combat engineers hadn't set their charges anywhere near the complex's 4 corner pins, but they were still worried about the unit's main supports. Each of the 5 levels was equipped with a set of Terrelium anti-gravity discs. In theory, as long as the gravity controls were operating correctly, the support structure could have been made of dental floss and it wouldn't have been in danger of snapping. Across from them, the administration building crashed into the old orphanage, and they both dropped from sight. Ashley and Morgenstern faced each other. The mortician bled from his face, ear, and hand. Kaz appeared on the path behind them. He paused, seeing that Ashley was holding her sword, her assault rifle abandoned in the grass. Kazimov raised his rifle on the lunatic killer. "Aim for his head," Ashley said. "His clothes are all Terrelium." Kaz fired, but the mortician dashed off to the side. On the run, Morgenstern produced 3 throwing knives from beneath his coat and hurled them at Ashley and Kaz. Ashley ducked, dodged, and pursued. Morgenstern attacked her with several strikes from the axe. Ash evaded them, but only just. Kaz couldn't get the serial killer in his sights. Ashley was in his way. Morgenstern attacked Ashley with the axe, the handle, his elbows, his feet, knees, and one good fist. Ashley dodged the sharp axe head, blocked the handle and elbows. She took a knee to the ribs, dodged one kick, evaded another, then ducked the final haymaker. Morgenstern stepped back to switch his grip on the axe. Ashley didn't need the pause. She slashed upward, taking his weapon hand at the wrist. stepping back as the axe in hand fell to the ground. Morgenstern looked at his disembodied hand. In the sky behind them, Zeros at the controls of the terminal facility set their elevation for sea level. Aware that the descent needed to appear as if it were the result of an explosion, the kids controlling the gravity drive had been instructed to bring it down as fast as it would go. With howls of glee, the first unit of the newly liberated district began its plunge toward freedom. The orphans in the garages, having strapped themselves into cars, instinctively clutched at the steering wheels and restraints as the horizon tipped to the side. On the trail behind Morgenstern, Mono stepped out. The 300-pound tuxedoed lion looked tired and groggy. He yawned. He'd been napping. Kaz hesitated, shocked and confused by the giant cat. He had lived there all his life and never seen anything like it. "Hey, Mono," Ashley knelt, summoning the massive feline. Mono padded over, walking right past the lethal mortician in his severed hand. The cat didn't even notice the hand. He did, however, pause at the bit of ear. Morgenstern watched the cat sniff the piece of meat and pick it up between his teeth. Morgenstern, minus a hand, reached beneath his coat and pulled a pistol. He aimed and fired into Mono's back. The cat flinched and whimpered at the sound of the gun. The impact drove him toward the ground. Mono dropped the bit of ear and crawled, whimpering, over to Ashley. In the distance, the massive juvenile detention facility, the Bolt, tilted to the side and lost altitude. Morgenstern brought his weapon around on Ashley. Kaz fired at him. Morgenstern took 2 bullets to the chest and ran from the trail. Ashley checked Mono for blood. There wasn't any. She found the bullet trapped in his fur and pulled it out. He licked her hand. "Stay here," she told Mono, and with a glance at Kaz, picked up her sword and took off in pursuit of Morgenstern. Ash saw him ahead. He dashed toward the elevator. Kaz, on the hoverboard, opened fire on Morgenstern again. The bullets raced past his shoulder, bouncing off the closed metal doors. Morgenstern ran from the elevator as Ashley and Kasimov pursued. He quickly realized that the limited space of the level produced a ledge in every direction. The bullet was falling past them. Morgenstern reached the edge and fearlessly leapt into the air, jumping for the falling rooftops of the Bolt, just a few hundred yards below. Ashley sprinted after him and leapt into the open space. Kaz followed on the hoverboard, firing at the serial killer. The movement of the buildings, combined with their own velocity, had an otherworldly feel, almost like jumping onto some low-gravity moon. The landing should have killed them, but Ashley watched Morgenstern land softly on the falling prison. She reached it just behind him. Kaz, on the hoverboard, sailed past her. Back in the campground, Sky and Jeff had discovered the giant cat. Jeff sprinted toward Mono and buried his face in his fur. Reunited at last, Mono licked Jeffrey's face and playfully wrestled with the boy. Sky, having never seen the cat before, stared at Jeff, confused as if this boy and the whole world were absolutely crazy. The horizon shifted eerily in the distance, and the buildings of the city flowed past beneath them as the district broke up and drifted out toward the ocean. On the rooftop of the Bolt, Morgenstern fired at Ashley. Her only weapon was the sword. Kaz fired 6 rounds at Morgenstern as he fell toward them. The Bolt was moving at a 45-degree angle to the south, and as Morgenstern fled, the circumstances weirdly accelerated his steps to the north, multiplied by gravity and the structure's horizontal motion, like running down an escalator. Behind them, the drives on the athletic complex had clearly cut out. Soon the 2 units had come parallel with one another. Due to its weaker drives and the Bolt's stronger charge, the athletic complex fell past the prison wing. Morgenstern leapt through the sky once again, back toward the athletic complex. The simultaneous descent of the units made the jump look as if he were flying. Ashley and Kaz followed. Kaz fired, but the shots went wide and were wasted. Captain Snow hadn't missed a moment of the aeronautical engagement. Invisible, she watched, but didn't yet intervene. When the explosion separated the pieces of the district, King and Sorpresa were ferrying wounded adults and children from the charred and smoking remains of God's Hotel. The other buildings were on the move, and the hotel remained stationary. They had decided to stay and help the wounded. First Sergeant King had briefly stopped in the security wing to requisition Splitter's help. He discovered the cell door ajar and the staff sergeant's lifeless body within. King instantly understood what had happened. Morgenstern and Keller had taken Splitter's face cam before their attack. It would be hours before the sergeant's corpse could be properly looked after, so he closed the door and turned back to the issue at hand. Ash followed Morgenstern as he leapt from the bolt. She tucked her arms and accelerated through the air, determined to overtake the monster that had only moments earlier murdered scores of innocent teachers and children, and then out of spite tried to kill her beloved cat. Morgenstern reached the central fields, larger and 2 levels up from the lowest campground plane. In the weird falling gravity, the grass under his feet broke crisply under his boots as he touched down. Overhead, Ashley shot past him. Morgenstern turned. He looked for his pursuers but saw only Kazimov, some distance back. Kaz, with an open shot, hesitated to fire. The giant realized why and spun, but a moment too late. Ashley, behind him, had the wind and gravity at her back. She was already moving, the sword held high. The giant tried to get his arm around in time, but then the sword bit into him, driving diagonally from his collarbone to his hanging rib. Morgenstern's conscious head, attached to the upper torso, watched itself fall away from his waist and legs. The left hand, holding the pistol, was now separated from his head and could not be made to fire. Ashley stood over him. Morgenstern felt the recently watered grass soak his neck and the back of his head. This was the feeling from his nightmare, the repetitive dream, in which a younger Ashley defended a slumbering seaside town from his draconic self. In his dream, she held a flaming sword. He looked up at her. She glared at him, the bloody red sword held low at her side. The sun flashed across the silver of the sword, turning it gold, and the blood a brilliant orange. Behind the teen, Morgenstern's enhanced eyes discerned another figure. An invisible female hovered in the air. She was armored, just like the staff sergeant had been, and held a long-barreled rifle. Ashley saw the monster look up and through her. He was dying. Unaware of her spectral shadow, Ashley stepped away. Captain Snow attached a large suppressor to her rifle and floated down toward the dying killer. She placed the barrel at the center of Morgenstern's forehead. The cold oiled metal of the silencer caressed his skin. She knew that Morgenstern, with his black faceted eyes and enhanced vision, could see her. She smiled and fired. Morgenstern felt the ejected gases blister his skin. He heard the sizzling of his brains as the round punched through the gray matter behind his eyes, and then all was dark. Captain Snow kicked off from the field and drifted away. Kazimov had landed the hoverboard and stood with Ashley. Neither of them heard the suppressed shot over the roar of the wind. Sky and Jeffrey touched down in the convertible. The pair had managed to get Mono into the back seat. Jeffrey and Mono jumped from the car and hung in the delayed gravity before landing on the grass. They romped through the air, playing in the suppressed natural forces as the unit plunged earthward. Too soon, however, the descent flattened out and gravity returned to normal. The convoy of buildings passed over Long Beach Harbor and out to sea. The burning wreckage of the administration building and the old orphanage settled to the shore, while the Bolt, athletic complex, and school terminals drifted over the ocean. Ash checked Mono again, combing through his fur for any sign of blood or a sore spot. He was perfectly fine. Her father had said that Mono was created in an experiment using domesticated felines for law enforcement. While the big cat's temperament may not have been ideal, apparently bullet-resistant fur had been one of his genetic enhancements. Ashley laughed, astonished and yet not at all surprised. Once they'd crossed in international waters, and an ACPD pursuit force still hadn't materialized, the orphans let down their collective guard. Hambone and the other members of the Fist found Ashley and her crew, as they all naturally congregated back down on the campground level. "What now?" Hambone asked. "I'm taking a nap," Ashley said. "Screw that. We're in a party," Hambone laughed. He pointed across the water. "We called the Bolt and the terminals. We're going to tie them all together. We'll be back to normal in no time." He smiled. Their structures were gradually drifting closer together. Soon they'd been crudely lashed together. The blown bridges were shoddily repaired. Hambone organized a barbecue, and by late afternoon, all the orphans had been fed. Ash and her friends sat in the sand around a fire pit, and watched the sunlight fade from the heavens. In the distance, a school of dolphins investigated the buildings on their journey out to sea. A week ago, I never would have believed this was possible, Hambone said. Shit, I don't believe it now, Kaz replied. In the early evening, on the distant horizon, someone pointed out a group of lights moving toward them. The kids scrambled for their weapons, but by the time the ambulances were in range, they had decided not to fire on them. First Sergeant King had coerced an entire convoy of Red Cross to sail out and help the battered kids. Soon the wounded had all been treated, the hostage nurses and the medical wards were all released. Any orphans severely wounded, if necessary, were evacuated back to the staging area to be set up now on God's Hotel. They were all promised that no criminal charges would be filed. That night, Ash, Jeffrey, and Mono fell asleep before a roaring fire, surrounded by their friends, battle-scarred heroes, one and all. Epilogue. Baby Steps. The media didn't know what to do with the Ashley Fox, Martin Dunkirk, and District 13 story. Senator Danforth Gray called a press conference and demanded reforms. He even renounced his citizenship, right there on live stream. The nation held its collective breath. Everyone expected federal agents to leap from the shadows and bludgeon him to death with lead pipes. But it didn't happen. In fact, nothing happened. No one arrested the senator or even yelled obscenities. The newscast continued rolling, and so Danforth continued talking. I knew my grandfather, Dakota, had written those words all those years ago. How ashamed am I that an innocent girl tortured and nearly murdered reads them in her own defense. Why haven't we done anything? Why haven't I done anything? Why haven't we helped them? This country is called the U.S. Let us help one another. I do believe everyone should be equal under the law. Gates of citizenship are wrong. We should know better. How many martyrs, how many saviors, how many reformers, and how many more wars before we can live in peace? None of us are zeros. We will build a better nation, a better world, with liberty and justice for all. Even Captain David Gray, the senator's son, had tuned in. He watched his father campaign for change. He supposed it was the silver lining, but he feared that the zeros of District 13 would become little more than yesterday's headline. Bumper sticker politics. It would happen before their food supplies ran out. In the morgue, below the lowest mapped levels of the Bolt, Cedric checked the security feeds and made a list of where his comrades had fallen. He tucked the list into his pocket and gestured for Bobby to follow with a hover cart. First they went to the Bolt's command center, where Mr. Dunkirk's conscious head sat in a shallow platter of blood and water. Despite the burns and lack of a body, his father's eyes were open and followed them as they crossed the room. Perhaps he wished to speak, but without lungs or a voice box, there was little he could say. After it had grown dark in the central stadium, Governor Mame, atop her spike, opened her eyes. On the post beside her, Malice was also awake. Cedric stood before them with Bobby, who came forward and removed their heads from the wet posts. Cedric had installed the fail-safe pulse generators a couple years ago, anchored to the back of the skull under the scalp. In case of decapitation, the wafer-sized module cleaned and circulated nutrients and oxygen to the brain. Even though they lost their bodies, Mr. Dunkirk, Governor Mame, and Dr. Malice had survived. Whether or not they would again know speech and movement was another matter entirely. The Red Cross didn't get into the stadium until well after midnight. The heads of Governor Mame and Dr. Malice were gone, as well as their bodies. Almost all of the bodies were gone. Only a few remained on the gruesome stained field. The volunteers commented on the situation, but made no serious attempts at an immediate investigation. Under the circumstances, missing bodies, while odd, hardly registered as an emergency. They had seen the footage, along with everyone else. They would have to ask the orphans where the bodies had gone, if only in hopes of containing any type of viral outbreak. On the third level, Morgenstern's separated pieces had also been collected and carted off, but no one noticed his abandoned bloodstain, as no one had come looking for him. Monday morning, September 26th, 2310. Ashley stirred. She sat up, looking around. A week ago she had slept in the same spot, on the campground level, under the stars, surrounded by other orphans. That morning she had wakened to a mist-shrouded level, haunted by sounds of men creeping toward them. This week, the sun rose, illuminating a safe and secure, if battle-ravaged, District 13. Kaz and Sky slept next to her, Jeff in her arms. She kissed him as he slept. They were safe. Everything was just as it had been the night before. The dawning sun bathed her circle of friends in radiant warmth. Ashley shifted Jeff onto Mono, yawned, and stretched. Mono twisted himself into one of his absurd feline positions, utterly at peace with the boy leaning against him. Ash realized her worst fears had all come true, and she'd been ready. The sun seemed to rise for her alone that morning. For a moment, she felt whole, complete, fulfilled. Then she remembered that her parents were dead, and her grief returned like a lead weight, chained to her soul. The smile fell from her face before any of her friends woke to see it. Her moment of peace vanished, and the cold one, the fearful one, the killer inside her, returned. Something was wrong. She could feel it. Ash stepped up onto the log, surveying the area. She saw nothing out of the ordinary, heard no menacing sounds. They'd been homeless before. They'd slept outside. She remembered curling up early, under the moon and stars. It had been scary but fun. She hadn't been ready, but had done her best to care for her brother. Her father had been proud. Life is not without risk, he'd said. This time, things had been different. Ash had more children she needed to look out for, and despite their losses, she'd exceeded her own expectations. She doubted her father would return from the dead again, but stranger things had happened. He'd already done it once. She hoped he was proud of her, wherever he might be. Ash realized that the friends surrounding her were her family now. They didn't have anyone else looking out for them, and neither did she, Mono, or Jeff. She slowly sunk to a seated place on the log. As if on cue, Jeffrey woke, sat up, and looked around. He discovered Ashley on the nearby log, picked up the blanket, and joined her. Mono stretched out and meowed. Ash wrapped the blanket around Jeff's shoulders and smiled. He smiled back and reached down to scratch all the big cat's favorite spots. They were soon wrestling, both cubs of the same family. Soon the other children were awake too. Kaz sat next to Ash, and together they watched the rising sun paint the ocean with color. Before long, the water was filled with the sound of laughter and splashing. The children dared each other in leaping from the campground level, falling past the parking levels and plunging into the clear blue water 40 feet below. They jumped and dove and played for hours, and luckily not one child got hurt all day. The night of that first day came in cool, almost cold, from far out over the sea. Chased inside by the ocean's chill, Ash, Jeff, and their friends crashed in one of the green-striped dorms. Jeffrey woke in the middle of the night. The hall was filled with sleeping kids, but he saw Bobby Dunkirk awake and standing nearby. He was older, but Jeff easily recognized him. He was dressed in district-issue clothes, but pressed and spotless. Around his neck, he wore the 6 bullets, tied into 2 rows of 3, the empty rounds above the unfired ones. Jeffrey got up out of bed. He walked toward Bobby, but stopped. Bobby stood, waiting. Jeff slowly reached into his back pocket and pulled out the prototype, the Micronics. His thumb rested on the button. Jeff watched as Bobby reached to touch the tethered shells. Bobby's expression grew angry, aggressive, but he didn't move. Jeffrey raised his hand, pointing the rectangle at Bobby, who now took a quick step backward. Jeff pressed the button, and the blade snapped out with a loud crack of metal on metal. Bobby flinched and stumbled backward, falling to the ground. Jeff lowered the blade. Bobby scrambled from the room. Jeff turned to find Ashley standing behind him. She looked at the knife and back to him. He met her eyes. "That was Bobby Dunkirk, wasn't it?" she asked. "I saw him the first time just after they arrested you," Jeff answered. Ashley stared at the doorway. "He's been here all this time." Jeffrey looked at the knife in his hand and back up to Ashley. "Don't lose that," she said, nodding to the knife. Jeffrey nodded, retracted the blade, and pocketed the knife. He leaned over and picked up an assault rifle. Like a seasoned pro, he pulled back the charging handle, checking the chamber to see if it was loaded. Ashley smiled and tousled his hair. Jeffrey laughed and ducked away. They hadn't discussed the identical black knives tucked into their pockets. The Micronics hadn't come up at all, even after Bobby's appearance. It wasn't necessary for them to talk about it. Ashley was not at all sure if she had the original or if Jeff did. When she'd taken it from Von Kalt on the stairwell, the Metachron had ceased to exist. The Micronics had been its source, and it had simply returned. She was confident she could cure Bobby again, if need be.